The 1960s were a foundational period for Marvel Comics and superhero stories. As I said in the 60s Fantastic Four video essay I put out, the early FF stories by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee were some of my first comics, and are basically to blame for my addiction to the medium. The transcript for this essay is available on my website, witsendpod.com. After Kirby left Marvel with Fantastic Four number 102, the House of Ideas needed a way to maintain the King's energy, so the 70s had a rough start. One of Marvel's most reliable artists, John Romita, took over with FF number 103 to finish up the story Kirby started. This is a random side note, but there are so many Richard Nixon appearances in this comic, where only John F. Kennedy's hair made one cameo in FF number 17. Romita had to pick up Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, and Daredevil after their respective artists left. In a field like comics, which is deadline intensive, that can't be easy. There's no waiting for Kirby to come back. People had to hit deadlines, books had to be printed and distributed. Comics is still a business. With all of these books Romita picked up, he was such a trooper. His Fantastic Four work is clearly trying to emulate Kirby because that's what readers were used to. Romita's time as FF's main penciler wraps up with number 106. Luckily, Big John Buscema took over as the main FF artist for a big chunk of the 70s. There's an unpublished Fantastic Four story Kirby did that was stitched together to make FF number 108, featuring Janus the Nega Man. It features Kirby art, but the parts he didn't finish were finished by the two Johns, Romita and Buscema. Joe Sinnott inked the story. I want to mention early on, Sinnott saves this decade. Him being the main FF inker for the 70s gives it some ethos and lets it feel like the previous stories, even though Kirby wasn't around. It doesn't matter who the artist is, John Romita, John Buscema, Rich Buckler, George Perez, Keith Pollard, or John Byrne. Sinnott delivered his best each issue. After Kirby left, Lee's storytelling slows down, leading into a plot about the Thing becoming evil. That said, the Hulk vs. Thing fight in number 112 is a good time, and Buscema delivers a heavy-hitting throwdown. A rule of thumb about FF is when writers and artists run out of stories, they make Ben lose his powers, or he becomes evil. Writer Archie Goodwin steps in to script FF number 116, which shockingly shows Doctor Doom teaming up with the Four to take down a new villain named Overmind. Doom doesn't have a generous nature, he just doesn't want some random schmuck taking over the world before him. Lee left the book with number 125. When Roy Thomas takes over as writer-editor with the next issue, he and Buscema retell the team's origin as seen in FF number 1 for new readers. While a lot of the 70s doesn't introduce as many new iconic foundational ideas as the previous decade, it does remix and expand on characters and ideas produced in the 60s. A critique of this mindset can be the incestuous nature of how mainstream superhero comics never have a resolution. A dramatic event starts, things go back to normal, rinse and repeat. This is why stories during this time retread old ground, since this was the first generation of fans taking over the comics. Thomas has a habit of going back to the past and bringing back ideas. In FF number 132, he has Johnny switch his blue costume to a red one, which references the original Golden Age Carl Burgos android Human Torch. He keeps this suit for a while. One of the most important themes, if not the most important theme, is the reveal that Reed and Sue's son Franklin has powers. That would be the biggest takeaway of this decade. Early on, it's not explained what those powers are. Witch and babysitter Agatha Harkness plays a major role in the 70s. She's kind of like a deus ex machina and saves the FF often. She's the one who reveals that Franklin's powers are manifesting. The Roy Thomas written era, at least early on, feels like a Stan Lee cover band. He's really trying to lean into that Lee melodrama. Thomas at certain points breaks up Reed and Sue, and Johnny and Crystal just to drive the drama home. There are certain random characters that get a lot of page time. I believe the Fantastic Four's mustachioed landlord gets more appearances than Doctor Doom in the 70s. Agatha Harkness, who gets a surprising amount of development, has her own subplot taking place in the Witch Haven of New Salem. We're introduced to her origins and get a throwdown with the Salem 7. When a new writer like Roy Thomas, Jerry Conway, or Marv Wolfman takes over, there's a growing pains period where some of the stories feel redundant, but they each lean into their strengths and try to tell new stories. One of the criticisms I have about this decade is that there are way too many people steering the ship. Roy Thomas, Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, and a few others keep alternating between the role of writer and editor-in-chief. The different artists during this era include John Romita, John Buscema, Rich Buckler, George Perez, and Keith Pollard. Ron Wilson, one of my favorite Thing artists, does a fill-in. So does the legendary Ramona Fradon. While Romita and Buscema try to capture that Kirby energy, it's the mix of Buckler and Sinnott that fully leans into Kirby. During this time, artists like Buckler, late 60s Barry Windsor Smith, and Keith Giffen early in his career drew like Kirby clones. Smith is one of the artists who referenced Kirby's style, but developed his own. Then there's the infamous advice from cartoonist Wallace Wood, quote, "Never draw anything you can copy, never copy anything you can trace, never trace anything you can cut out and paste up." There is an artist carrying on the spirit of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko in the 70s, but he isn't working on FF or any of the bigger titles. During this time, writer-artist Jim Starlin was working on ancillary titles like Iron Man, Captain Marvel, and Adam Warlock. It's in these stories that he would bring Thanos to life and spark a cosmic renaissance at Marvel. Starlin, at the time, was one of the few superhero artists who handled almost every aspect of his stories. In a world where Starlin was putting out his psychedelic and existentialist stories, the standard superhero tropes don't really compare. He wasn't a clone, but used Kirby and Ditko's energy to fuel his style. One of the best decisions Buckler made was hiring Perez as his assistant, who took over FF and Cape Comics in general for a period. A situation of the student outgrowing the teacher. There's a point where Keith Pollard is inked by Pablo Marcos that suddenly feels like a more grounded comic. Marcos isn't going for a Marvel house style look, and it's a welcomed change of pace. People think Wolverine and Spider-Man get shoehorned into every comic, but in the 70s, Ben Grimm was the guy. I think part of it came from people not knowing what to do with the other characters, but Aunt Petunia's favorite nephew is objectively the most well-rounded one. At least he's the one who will catch someone's eye while looking at a cover. The Thing kind of became the main character during this time. Most of the covers focused on him. Also in 1974, he got his own title, Marvel 2-in-1, featuring The Thing, where he would team up with random characters throughout the Marvel universe. These stories are really fun and can be read as one-shots. I won't talk about them too much in depth here since I'm focusing on the main FF title. This book features art by one of my favorite Thing artists, Ron Wilson. Spider-Man had a similar book that launched in the early 70s called Marvel Team Up. In the 70s, Kirby returns to Marvel and leaves again in the same decade. I've talked about his return to Marvel work often over the years, but for FF, he did a good number of covers and even worked on What If, issue 11, where the Marvel bullpen becomes the Fantastic Four. During this era, Kirby pushed to have full control over the books he worked on, so Kirby writes, draws, and edits the What If one-shot. Funny enough, he depicts Stan as Mr. Fantastic and himself as the Thing.
Motherfucker looks just like the Thing.
It would have been better to get an actual FF story, but it's nice to see him come back and tell a story with his 70s style. If Kirby gave the 70s treatment to FF like he did with his other Marvel books at the time, it would have been crazy in the best way. There was a Silver Surfer graphic novel Kirby did with Stan Lee, but since that's not related to the main series, I won't cover it here. In 1978, Kirby left Marvel again to work in animation. He did designs and storyboards for the new Fantastic Four cartoon, which removed Johnny Storm and replaced him with Herbie the Robot. One of Kirby's first real jobs was working at Fleischer's animation studio, where he worked on Betty Boop and Popeye. So he goes back to animation because both major comics companies didn't treat him well. Luckily, Kirby had positive experiences working in animation during this time. When people talk about FF comics, John Byrne's name usually comes up. He does take over as FF's main penciler near the end of the decade with number 209. However, I won't even cover him now since he's getting plenty of coverage in my next essay. In Byrne's first story, Herbie the Robot from the FF cartoon gets introduced to the comics. The best part about this issue is how they explain Johnny Storm's exclusion from the series. Apparently, he wasn't around when they were signing the contracts. It wouldn't have been very interesting to summarize every little thing in detail. However, here are 10 stories from this era that stood out to me. Number 112, Hulk vs. Thing. While Hulk and Thing have fought a few times up till this point, this is their best fight so far. It's one of the few fights between heroes that doesn't end in a draw. Buscema nailed this fight. Number 116, Doctor Doom joins the FF. The Overmind arc is kind of a drag, but Doctor Doom joining the FF despite Reed Richards and stop Overmind is worth the price of admission. Doom doesn't want anyone else to take over the Earth but him. Number 131, Johnny and Crystal break up because of Quicksilver. Quicksilver calls Johnny's reflexes substandard. It takes a lot of heat to burn the Human Torch, but this issue breaks away from the main story and does its own thing. Ross Andrew draws an incredible Human Torch too. Number 140 to 141 features the origin of Annihilus. Honestly, every appearance by the living death that walks in the 70s is important because they tie into Franklin's powers. We get his origin of how he took over the negative zone. It's also revealed that Annihilus needs to use Franklin's powers to get stronger. Reed ends up zapping his son with the device that removes his powers, resulting in the breakup of Sue and Reed. Number 147 to 149, a Namor arc where he invades the surface to get Reed and Sue back together. Great art by Rich Buckler and inks by Joe Sinnott. Giant Size Fantastic Four number 4 features the first appearance of Multiple Man. Also, Charles Xavier gets airdropped from a helicopter, and it's one of the most goofy scenes you'll see in comics. He didn't have a parachute or anything, they just shoved this man out of a helicopter. Madrox has a cool design and can't control his powers. X-Men and FF start crossing over a lot later on, especially with Franklin. Number 157, just to see Rich Buckler draw a Metal Mephisto page. Number 176, George Perez draws Impossible Man joining the FF and invading the Marvel offices. There's a cameo by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and the Marvel Bullpen. Fantastic Four number 200, Reed Richards and Doctor Doom finally fight. This issue's cover is done by Jack Kirby, which is the last art he would produce for an FF comic. Reed defeats Doom in a one-on-one smackdown, weaponizing his ego against him. Number 210 to 213. There are a few Galactus arcs in this era. Number 175 has an amazing fight between High Evolutionary and Galactus because the Planet Eater went after Counter-Earth. This last arc in number 210 to 213 has the first appearance of a new herald named Terrax. There are cool fight scenes by John Byrne, but this arc has an actual impact on the story. Jack Kirby leaving Marvel was obviously a massive hit to the company. However, there was a stable of talented artists working, so the gears kept turning. The last essay I did was more of an introduction to the FF, more of a where to start video, which dives into the early days of Marvel and the history of FF in the 60s. This era isn't bad or trash by any means. The stories aren't as foundational as the 60s, and there's a lot of filler. It's more taking the foundation and mixing it up a little instead of reinventing the wheel. There are random moments like Thing and Hulk putting their grudge aside and teaming up. Franklin's universe-destroying powers manifest. Agatha Harkness gets a lot of page time. Johnny gets to grow up a little. There's the first mention of Sue as Invisible Woman. That Fever Dream comic was written, drawn, and edited by Jack Kirby before he left for animation. And why did Reed Richards build this massive coffee machine? The answer is why not. As always, the transcript for this essay and all of my other videos are available on my website, witsendpod.com. If it's not on there, it's not me. Share these essays around. Thanks for watching. Chaos ensues. Up next, the 80s.